The laughter broke out of him like something long buried finally clawing its way free of the earth. It was not a polite sound. It was not a careful, measured chuckle from a man who had learned to keep himself small and contained. It was full and ragged and startled, the kind of laugh that bends a man at the middle and forces his hand to the table for balance. And every single person sitting in that cramped supper room of the Dawson homestead turned to stare at Oliver Wallace as though the roof had just collapsed. Irene Dawson sat across from him with her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, wide brown eyes watching him with an expression caught somewhere between delight and alarm. There was a streak of flour still dusted along her jaw from the biscuits she had made that afternoon, and her dark hair had come loose from its pin on the left side, and she looked so precisely, perfectly herself in that moment that Oliver's chest did something he had no language for. He could not stop. He pressed his fist to his mouth. He turned his face toward the window where the last thin light of the Texas evening was bleeding out across the cracked and parched ground. The drought had taken most of the color from this landscape months ago. It had taken his cattle, his savings, the cheerful way his neighbor Hector used to whistle while he rode the fence line, and it had taken Oliver's last real laugh sometime in the spring of 1882, when the sky was still capable of producing rain and the world still seemed like a place that rewarded effort and patience and honest work. It was now the autumn of 1883, and Irene Dawson had said something at supper that had pulled him all the way back from whatever dark interior country he had been living in, and he could not stop laughing, and he had no idea what to do with any of it. He would understand it all eventually. He would understand how a woman he had been half terrified of, for the better part of 6 months had managed to reach past every wall he'd constructed, every careful distance he'd maintained, every polite formality he deployed to keep her at arm's length. But to understand it, he had to go back to the beginning, back to a Tuesday in March when a letter arrived and changed everything. The drought had officially begun in the summer of 1882 in Crockett County, Texas, though the land itself had been showing signs of distress for 2 full years before that. Oliver Wallace had come out from Virginia at 24 years old with a modest inheritance, an engineering mind, and a romantic notion of the frontier that the frontier had systematically and thoroughly destroyed over the subsequent 6 years. He was 30 now, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who worked from first light to last light tended to become, with dark blonde hair that the sun had bleached at the temples and hands that were permanently mapped with small scars from fence wire and iron, and the general hostility of tools. He owned 340 acres outside of a town called Marlow Creek, which was not a creek at all, but rather a dry depression in the earth that had allegedly once held water during the administration of James Buchanan. He had built the main house himself with help from a carpenter named Ruiz, and he had built the barn, and he had fenced the property in stages over 5 summers, and he had raised cattle until the drought killed them, and he had planted a kitchen garden that the drought had turned to gray powder, and by the winter of 1882 he had been eating beans from a tin and having conversations with his horse because there was no other conversational option available. His nearest neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Calloway, who was 67 years old and had buried 2 husbands and 1 son on this ground, was the one who first mentioned the advertisement. "You need a wife," she told him one January morning when he had ridden over to see if she needed wood split. She was sitting on her porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the mild cold, and she said it the way she said most things, which was without any particular softness or ceremony. Oliver had been in the process of swinging down from his horse, and he paused with one boot still in the stirrup. "I beg your pardon. A wife, a helpmeet, a companion. Someone to share the burden of this place before the burden of this place takes you under." She gave him a long, flat look. "You look half dead, Oliver. You've looked half dead since September." He finished dismounting. He did not argue, which was itself a kind of agreement. "There are services," Mrs. Calloway said. "Papers and correspondence arrangements, reputable ones. Women back east who want a fresh start and men out here who need the company. There's no shame in it. My second husband found me through exactly such an arrangement. You were a mail-order bride, Oliver said, and he heard the surprise in his own voice and was immediately embarrassed by it. I was a practical woman in a difficult situation, she said crisply, which is precisely what you are, except that you are a man and you persist in believing that makes you immune to loneliness. He split her wood. He rode home. He sat for 3 evenings with a blank piece of paper in front of him, and on the 4th evening he wrote a letter to the correspondence service Mrs. Calloway had pressed into his hand on a torn piece of brown paper. He described himself honestly. He described the land honestly. He described the drought with the kind of careful understatement that was perhaps not fully honest, but was the best he could manage without making the whole enterprise sound like a disaster, which it was. He sent the letter. He expected nothing. 6 weeks later he received a response. Her name was Irene Dawson, and she was 26 years old, and she was from a small city in Ohio called Granville. And she wrote the way someone talks when they have decided to simply be direct, because life is too short for anything else. She said she was a schoolteacher, that she had been one for 4 years, that the school had closed when the town's population had declined after the primary employer, a small mill, had shuttered. She said she had no family left in Granville, only a cousin in Missouri whom she did not particularly like. She said she was not fragile, that she could work, that she was not seeking a rich man or an easy life, that what she wanted was simply something real to build. She said, and this was the line that Oliver read 4 times and then folded the letter and put it in the drawer and left it there for 2 days before he could go back to it. I am not a woman who will pretend things are fine when they are not, and I am not a woman who will stay quiet to keep the peace, and if those qualities are a problem for you, I think you had better say so now and spare us both the trouble. He wrote back the same day he opened the drawer. He told her the honest truth about the drought. He told her the cattle were gone, and the garden was gone, and the money was thinning, though the land itself was still his, and he believed in the land, and he believed in the rain coming back, and he believed that 2 people working together had a better chance of surviving a hard time than 1 person working alone. He told her that he had no objection to a woman who said what she thought, that he might not always know how to respond to it, but that he considered it preferable to the alternative. He did not tell her that he had not laughed in months. He did not tell her that there were evenings when he sat on the porch and looked at the dead grass and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for, something that was not grief exactly but was adjacent to it, a kind of gray weight that had settled in and seemed to be taking up permanent residence. They exchanged 5 more letters over the course of 8 weeks. Irene Dawson wrote about her students with a warmth that he found unexpectedly moving. She wrote about Ohio winters with a dry humor that made him smile, actually smile, at the paper in his hands. She wrote about her father who had been a veterinarian and who had taught her to approach problems systematically and without panic. And she wrote about her mother who had died when Irene was 14, and who had been, by Irene's account, the most stubbornly optimistic person who had ever drawn breath in Licking County, Ohio. He wrote back about Virginia, about the Blue Ridge Mountains he had grown up looking at, and the flatness of West Texas which had unsettled him for the first year, and which he had come to love in a complicated and somewhat masochistic way. He wrote about the land and what he saw in it, the potential beneath the cracked surface, the way the sky went colors at sunset that he had never seen anywhere else. He did not write about his parents, who had not approved of his leaving, and who had made their disapproval known in a letter 2 years into his Texas tenure and had more or less been silent since. He did not write about the dark feeling in his chest, the gray weight. In February, she wrote to say she had purchased a train ticket. He drove the wagon to the station in Marlow Creek on a cold Tuesday morning in March of 1883, and the train was 40 minutes late, and he stood on the platform with his hat in his hands and felt a complicated knot of feelings that he was not going to examine too closely, because examining feelings was not a skill he had developed. She stepped off the train with a single large trunk and a smaller bag over her shoulder, and she was not at all what he had imagined, which was not a bad thing but was a recalibrating thing. He had imagined someone softer looking, somehow, more uncertain. Irene Dawson was medium height with very dark hair and dark eyebrows and a direct, assessing gaze that swept the platform and found him, and settled on him with an expression that was frank and composed and not at all nervous, which made him feel, by contrast, extremely nervous. She walked toward him with her trunk bumping along behind her. "Oliver Wallace," she said, and it was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on his head because he did not know what else to do with his hands. "Irene Dawson, welcome to Texas." She looked at the flat, dusty, sun-hammered street behind him. She looked at the handful of storefronts, most of which had faded paint and the general air of a place that was holding on. She looked at the sky, which was the vivid hard blue of a place that had not seen a cloud in 6 weeks. "It's something," she said, and her tone was completely neutral, which he found both terrifying and oddly reassuring. He helped her with the trunk. They loaded it into the wagon. He drove. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the landscape unspool ahead of them. The pale grass and the reddish dust and the occasional cedar and the scrub oak and the dry creek beds, and she asked questions. Not the polite, carefully non-committal questions of someone trying to be pleasant. Real questions. How many acres? What kind of soil composition? Was there ground water if you dug deep enough? How many cattle had he lost, and what was his plan for rebuilding the herd when the rain came back? He answered all of them. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he had more to say than he expected. That talking to her was different from talking to himself, which was the only conversational option he had had for most of the past year. They had agreed in their letters on a courtship arrangement. She would stay in the house. He had given her the better of the 2 bedrooms, the one with the east-facing window, and they would take the time to know each other properly before any decision was made permanent. He had thought this was a civilized and responsible plan. He had thought he was being respectful. What he had not accounted for was that Irene Dawson did not believe in wasted time. By the second morning, she had reorganized the kitchen in a way that was immediately and obviously more logical than the arrangement he had been using, and she did it with such brisk efficiency that he did not feel criticized, only slightly humbled. By the 3rd day, she had identified 3 significant issues with the root cellar's ventilation that had been causing the potatoes to spoil faster than necessary, and she explained this to him with the same systematic clarity that she had evidently inherited from her veterinarian father. By the end of the 1st week, she had established a kitchen garden with seedlings she had brought from Ohio packed carefully in damp cloth, and she was watering them from the well with the focused attention of someone who had decided these plants were going to live and was prepared to argue with the climate about it. He watched her do all of this from a careful distance, and he felt something he could not name, something that was somewhere between admiration and alarm, and he maintained his careful distance and his careful politeness, and he was, by the standards of the arrangement, doing everything correctly. He was also, by any honest assessment, beginning to be somewhat undone. It was not any single thing she did. It was the accumulation. The way she argued with Mrs. Calloway about herb drying methods, and was completely unembarrassed when Mrs. Calloway turned out to be right. The way she sat with her supper plate balanced on her knees on the porch some evenings because she said she liked to watch the sky change color, and the way she watched it with this quiet, open attention that he found himself watching from inside the door. The way she thanked him for small things, not effusively but simply, directly, as though she had noticed the effort and wanted him to know she had noticed. The way she did not pretend that things were fine when they were not. In April, the pump on the well began to fail. This was a significant problem. This was the kind of problem that, in the dark arithmetic of drought survival, could tip from manageable to catastrophic in a matter of days. Oliver spent 2 full days trying to repair it himself with the tools he had and the mechanical knowledge he had acquired over 6 years of this kind of trial and error. And on the evening of the second day, when he came in from the yard with his shirt plastered to his back and his jaw set, and his hands bleeding slightly from where a wrench had slipped, Irene was waiting at the kitchen table with his tools laid out in order of likely utility, and a diagram she had drawn from memory of a pump repair method her father had used once on a farm outside of Granville. He stood in the doorway and looked at the diagram and looked at her. "You knew how to do this," he said. "I knew how it had been done once," she said. "I don't know if it will work here, but it seems worth trying." They fixed the pump together the following morning. It took 4 hours. At one point she was lying on her stomach in the dirt, her arms down in the pump housing, and she was describing what she could feel by touch alone while he worked from above. And they were communicating in a kind of shorthand that had developed very quickly, and that neither of them remarked upon. And when the pump finally drew water, they both sat back from it at the same moment and looked at each other, and she had a streak of mud across her cheekbone, and he was absolutely certain he was in serious trouble. He did not say any of this. He said, "Good work," in a voice that he managed to keep fairly level, and she nodded, and they went about the rest of the day. The trouble, Oliver Wallace told himself through April and into May, was the situation. The forced proximity, the shared purpose, the fact that they were two adults working side by side toward a common survival goal in a place that did not give you much room for anything except that goal. It was not personal, he told himself. It was circumstantial. It was the drought and the isolation, and the fact that she was a reasonable, capable, interesting person, and he had been without reasonable, capable, interesting company for too long. He told himself this fairly convincingly right up until the evening in mid-May when he found her sitting alone in the barn. He had gone out to check on the one remaining horse and the 2 goats that Irene had acquired through a trade with a family passing through, and he found her sitting in the straw with her knees pulled up and her face turned away, and she was not crying exactly, but she was very still in the way a person is still when they are trying to hold themselves together. He stopped in the barn door. "Irene," he said. She turned her head and the lantern light caught her face, and she looked tired in a way that was different from ordinary work tired, and she looked young, and she looked like someone who was being very brave and finding it, in this particular moment, somewhat costly. "I got a letter today," she said, "from my cousin, in Missouri." He came into the barn and sat down in the straw a few feet from her, which was not something he had planned to do but seemed like the correct thing. "Bad news." She was quiet for a moment. "My father's house in Granville sold. He died 2 years ago, and I've been waiting for the estate to settle, and it's settled now." She paused. "It's not the money, though there is some money which is useful. It's just, I had not really thought about the fact that there is now no house, no particular place. The address I grew up with has been replaced by someone else's life." He did not say anything immediately because he knew, from the way she had said it, that she was not looking for a solution. She was looking for someone to simply receive the weight of the thing. "I know that feeling," he said finally. She turned and looked at him. "My family in Virginia," he said. "We are not close. My leaving it was a point of contention. The house I grew up in still exists, I suppose, but it doesn't feel like a place I could go back to. There is no address that feels like home in the way it's supposed to." He paused. "It is a strange feeling to be people of no fixed origin." She was quiet, watching him with those frank brown eyes. "Is this home?" she asked, and it was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He looked around the barn, the lantern making warm shapes in the dark, the horse quietly pulling at his hay, the goats breathing in the corner. Outside, the cracked and thirsty land, and the sky full of stars so dense they seemed almost pressed against the ground. "It is becoming so," he said, and he meant the land, he told himself. He meant the land. They sat in the barn together for another half an hour before going in. They did not talk very much after that first exchange, but the silence was the comfortable kind, And when they went inside, Irene made tea on the stove and they drank it at the kitchen table, and she asked him about Virginia. Not about the family difficulty, but about the mountains, what they looked like, whether the colors really were the colors people described. He told her about the fall foliage, the specific burning quality of Virginia October, and she listened with the same open attention she gave the Texas sunsets. He lay awake for a long time that night. The month of May brought 2 small rains. Not enough, not nearly enough, but enough to remind the land that water existed, and Irene's seedlings had survived and were producing, modestly but genuinely. And Oliver had made contact with a rancher named Dupree about the possibility of purchasing a small starting herd on credit with an arrangement for repayment. And the conversation with Dupree had gone well, and things were, if not good, at least turning a corner from desperate toward merely difficult. Oliver should have felt more relief than he did. He felt, instead, a deepening of the thing he had been trying to manage for 2 months, the thing that had started as admiration and had complicated itself into something that had no safe name in the context of an arrangement that was still, technically, undecided. He had not raised the subject. He did not know how to raise the subject. The agreed courtship period had not been assigned a specific terminus, and he had been operating on the assumption that she would indicate when and whether she wished to proceed, because it seemed to him that she was the one who had traveled 1,200 miles, and she was the one who ought to have the primary authority over how this concluded. What he had not considered was that she was waiting for him to indicate something. He would not understand this until it was almost too late. The indication of how close to late he was getting came, appropriately enough, from Mrs. Calloway, who had appointed herself the conscience of Crockett County, and fulfilled this role with considerable enthusiasm. It was a Thursday in late May, and Oliver had ridden over to help Mrs. Calloway with a broken fence section, and the old woman had watched him work for 20 minutes in silence before she said, without preamble, "Irene Dawson is a fine woman." "She is," Oliver said. "She came a very long way. She did. She has stayed considerably past the point where a woman of lesser determination would have concluded she'd made a mistake." Oliver stopped working and looked at her. "Has she said something to you?" "She has said nothing to me. She is too proud to say anything to me. That is precisely the problem." Mrs. Calloway fixed him with the look that he suspected had dismantled stronger men than him. "She doesn't know what you want, Oliver. And she is a woman who made a practical arrangement with her eyes open, and she can accept almost any outcome, but she cannot continue indefinitely in uncertainty. It is not fair to ask her to." He looked at the fence post he had been resetting. "I don't know how to begin that conversation," he said, and it was the truest thing he had said out loud in months. "You begin it by opening your mouth," Mrs. Calloway said, "and saying something honest." He thought about that all the way home. He thought about it through supper that evening, which Irene made from the garden's first real production, a soup that was simple but tasted precisely right after months of inadequate meals. And he thought about it while she washed the dishes and he dried them, which had become their ordinary evening routine without either of them deciding it would be. And he thought about it when they sat on the porch afterward in the cooling dark. He opened his mouth to say something honest. What came out was, "The Dupree arrangement is moving forward," she said. "That's good," he said. "It'll take time to rebuild, but I think we can manage it," she said. "I agree." He said nothing else, and the moment for honesty passed, and he was furious with himself in a quiet, internal way that produced no useful action. June arrived. The heat intensified to a degree that Oliver associated with the deep summer of drought years, that particular flat, blistering quality that seemed to remove all moisture from the world and replace it with a kind of stunned silence. Even the birds went quiet in the middle of the day. Even the goats stood in the barn shade with their heads down and their eyes half closed. Irene worked through the heat with the same systematic determination she brought to everything. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, and she adapted her schedule to the heat, working early and late and resting through the worst of the afternoon, and she showed no particular signs of being broken by the Texas summer, which was either encouraging or, Oliver thought sometimes, a kind of indictment of how formidable she was. It was in June that the other complication arrived. A man named Gerald Hewitt rode out to the property on a Tuesday morning, and Irene was the first one to see him from the kitchen window. And by the time Oliver came in from the east field where he had been repairing a section of fence, she was standing in the yard with a very particular quality of stillness that he had begun to recognize as her version of controlled alarm. Gerald Hewitt was somewhere around 35, with the look of a man who had once been handsome and was still trading on the residual. He rode a good horse and he had good clothes and he sat very easily in the saddle. And when Oliver came around the corner of the house, Hewitt smiled at him with the practiced warmth of a man who used charm as a professional tool. "Oliver Wallace," Hewitt said. "I've been hoping to make your acquaintance. Gerald Hewitt out of San Angelo. I run a land acquisition concern." Oliver stopped next to Irene, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, which he registered and which he did not move away from. "What kind of acquisition concern?" he said. "Simple business," Hewitt said. "I identify properties in the area that might be of interest to investors from back east who are looking to consolidate land holdings. Your parcel came up in my research, 340 acres. Good water rights, even with the current drought conditions. A man in your situation, and I say this with respect, not criticism, might benefit from a conversation about liquidation." "I'm not liquidating," Oliver said. Hewitt smiled, untroubled. "Of course not right now. But times are difficult. I'd simply like to leave an offer on the table, a generous one, something worth considering." He looked briefly, too briefly and too deliberately at Irene. "Especially for a man with new responsibilities." The implication of that look was clear. It was the implication that Irene Dawson was a liability, an additional mouth, an expense he could not afford in bad times. It was said in the language of business courtesy, but it was said. Oliver felt something cold and hard settle into his chest. "I appreciate you riding out," he said, in a voice that was completely level. "But I'm not interested in discussing the sale of this property. Not now, not down the line. You're welcome to water your horse at the trough before you go." Hewitt looked at him for a moment, measuring. Then he nodded, pleasantly enough, and rode toward the trough. Irene said quietly beside him, "He'll be back." "I know," Oliver said. "Will you really not consider it?" she asked, and her voice was carefully neutral. He turned and looked at her. "No, I won't. This land is not something I'm going to sell because a bad season made it look like a liability. The drought will end." He paused. "And what he implied with that look about you being a responsibility I can't afford, that was wrong, and I want you to know that I know it was wrong." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. "Thank you," she said, not effusively, simply. Hewitt rode away and did not immediately return, but his presence lingered like a problem that had been deferred rather than resolved, and Oliver added it to the list of things he was carrying. July was brutal. The heat peaked in the second week at a sustained intensity that killed 2 of the 3 plants in the second row of Irene's kitchen garden despite everything she tried to do for them. And she knelt in the dirt and looked at the dead stems with a flat, deliberate expression that was somehow worse than if she had cried, and Oliver crouched next to her and said, "We'll replant the row in August when it cools. Some things will still have time to come in before first frost." She turned and looked at him, and for just a moment the careful composure slipped, and what was underneath was very tired and very determined and very human, and he was aware of how close they were, both crouching in the dirt of the kitchen garden, and he was aware of her shoulder barely an inch from his, and he was aware of approximately everything about that moment with an attention that was far past what the situation technically required. She said, "You are more patient than I expected." He said, "So are you." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt and went back to the work. He sat in the dirt of the kitchen garden for slightly longer than was warranted, looking at the ground. The problem that Oliver Wallace had, and that he was becoming increasingly unable to ignore, was not simply that he had developed feelings for Irene Dawson that were well past the practical and companionable range that the arrangement had presumably been designed to produce. The problem was that he did not know whether she felt anything corresponding, and he was afraid in a way that he found slightly embarrassing, because he was a grown man who had built a barn with his own hands and had survived a drought that had destroyed his neighbors, and he had no good reason to be afraid of a conversation. Except that this particular conversation had stakes he had not had to contend with before. The land, the drought, the failed crops, the depleted finances, these were all things that he could face because they were external, because you could work against them, because effort and ingenuity were legitimate responses. What Irene might say if he said what he was actually thinking, that was something he could not work against. He could only receive it. And what he was actually thinking, standing in the kitchen doorway one August evening watching her read at the table with her hair down because it was too hot to keep it pinned, the lamplight doing things to the darkness of it, her foot tucked under her in the chair in the completely unself-conscious way she sat when she thought she was alone, what he was actually thinking was that he did not want her to leave. Not because she was useful, though she was. Not because the arrangement made practical sense, though it did. But because the specific person she was, with her directness and her dry observations and her systematic approach to problems, and the way she sat with the Texas sunsets, and the way she had cried in the barn without wanting to, and the way she had said to him, once, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that she thought the thing she missed most about teaching was the moment a student understood something they had not understood before, the particular light of that. He did not want to stop being in proximity to all of that. He had not felt that way about anyone or anything in a very long time. He thought about Mrs. Calloway's instruction. Open your mouth. Say something honest. He walked into the kitchen. Irene looked up from her book. Is something wrong? No, he said. Then he sat down across from her, which was unusual, because if there was nothing wrong, there was no particular reason to sit down. She marked her page and put the book down and watched him with the direct, patient attention that she gave to things she was taking seriously. I want to say something, he said. And I want to be clear that you are under no obligation to respond in any particular way, and the arrangement as it stands, whatever you decide, I want you to know that, Oliver, she said. He stopped. Are you trying to tell me how you feel, she asked. A pause. Yes. Then just say it, she said, and her voice was very quiet and very even, and her hands were folded on the table and she was completely still. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. I don't want this to be an arrangement anymore, he said. I would like it to be a real thing. I want to marry you, Irene. Not because the situation recommends it, and not because you've come a long way, and not because it's practical, because of who you are, he stopped. Because I have been living in a kind of gray place for a long time, and since you came here it is not gray anymore, and I don't know how to say that more plainly than that. The room was quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could not read her expression, and his heart was beating in an entirely inappropriate manner for a man who had presented himself throughout this entire situation as being steady and composed. Oliver, she said. Yes. I came to Texas to build something real, she said. I told you that in the first letter. You did. I have been waiting, she said, for 6 months for you to say something like what you just said. She paused. I had begun to think you might not. Something happened in his chest that was very difficult to categorize. I didn't know how, he said. I know, she said. I could see that. I could see you trying. A small, careful smile. You're not very hard to read, Oliver, once you know what to look for. He stared at her. Yes, she said, before he had rearranged himself enough to say anything else. Yes. Yes, I will marry you for the same reasons. Because this has become real and I don't want to go back to something less than that. She paused. And because you are a decent man, which is not as common as it should be. And because You did not sell this land just because someone told you it was failing, and because you sat with me in the barn without trying to fix anything, and because when Gerald Hewitt looked at me like I was a problem, you told him he was wrong without thinking twice about it." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight in the August heat, in the third year of a drought that had taken everything except it turned out this. "We'll need to ride to Marlow Creek," he said, "to see Judge Irrington about the license." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She picked up her book again. He sat at the table for a while longer because he did not particularly want to move, and she let him sit there. And after a while she said, without looking up from the page, "If you're going to sit there, you might as well have some tea." And he did, and they sat in the kitchen together in the warm dark, and he thought about the gray place and how far away it felt right now. They rode to Marlow Creek the following morning and spoke to Judge Irrington, a stout, affable man of 60 who had married approximately a third of Crockett County at various points, and who took considerable personal satisfaction in each one. He set the date for 2 weeks out, a Saturday in early September. 2 weeks. The word moved through Oliver's mind and rearranged everything. In those 2 weeks, small, ordinary things took on a quality they had not previously had. Sharing the morning chores, the coffee, the supper table. They talked more and differently, the guarded distance gone now, though in its place was something that was, if anything, more intense, because now there were no pretenses between them and the things they said to each other were simply what they meant. She told him about Granville, really told him, the full texture of a childhood in Ohio, the way her father had worked and how she had sometimes accompanied him on his rounds, the particular animal warmth of those mornings, the smell of damp hay and the sound of her father's calm voice talking down a frightened horse. She told him about her mother and what it had been to lose her at 14, and how it had made her, she thought, perhaps more practical than she might otherwise have been, more inclined to face things directly because she had learned early that prettying up the truth to make it easier was a kindness that did not last. He told her about Virginia properly, the parts he had left out of the letters. His father, who was brilliant and cold, and who had wanted Oliver to go into law, and had taken Oliver's refusal as a personal rejection. His mother, who was warm and somewhat defeated by her marriage, and who had written him a letter 3 years into his Texas tenure saying she was glad he had gone, that she was proud of him, and then had never mentioned it again in subsequent correspondence, as though the admission had briefly overwhelmed her defenses and she had retreated. He told Irene this, and she listened without interrupting and without offering a comfort that would have been too easy, and when he finished she said, "That sounds like it cost you something, going." And he said yes, and she said, "And it was still the right thing," and he said yes again, and she nodded once as though something had been confirmed. In those 2 weeks Gerald Hewitt returned. He arrived on a Thursday evening as the light was going golden, and this time he had another man with him, a younger man with a quiet, hard quality that Oliver read quickly as someone who was there for reasons beyond conversation. Irene was in the kitchen and Oliver was on the porch, and he stood up from the porch chair with a deliberateness that he hoped communicated what he intended it to communicate. "Mr. Wallace," Hewitt said, still pleasant, still with that professional smile, "I thought we might revisit our conversation." "I told you I wasn't interested," Oliver said. "Circumstances change," Hewitt said. He glanced at the house, casual and pointed. "I heard some interesting news in town. That you filed for a marriage license, that the situation here has become consolidated." He smiled. "A man with a new wife has more to protect. More reason to consider a secure offer rather than gambling on uncertain seasons." Oliver came down off the porch steps. He was aware of every inch of the distance between himself and these two men and the relative positions of everything around him. "Get off my land," he said, very quietly. Hewitt's pleasant expression did not waver. "I have a legal interest in—" "You have no legal interest in this property," Oliver said. You have a speculative commercial interest that I have declined twice. The third time will not be a conversation. Get off my land." The younger man shifted slightly. Oliver watched him shift without looking directly at him. The kitchen door opened behind Oliver and Irene came out onto the porch. She stood at the top of the steps and she looked at Gerald Hewitt with an expression that was perfectly clear and perfectly cold. "Mr. Hewitt," she said, "my fiancé asked you to leave. I am asking you to leave. If you require a third request, we will make that request to Judge Irrington, and we will include a description of the intimidation tactics you appear to be employing, which I would imagine an official record of would be significantly bad for a man who describes himself as running a legitimate land acquisition concern." Hewitt looked at her for a moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away, the younger man following. Oliver watched them go down the track and through the gate and out onto the road. He stood there until the dust settled behind them. He turned around. Irene was watching him from the porch with that even, direct gaze. "That was well done," she said. "You as well," he said, "the part about Judge Irrington." "I was not bluffing," she said. "We should tell the judge about him anyway. Men like that don't stop at conversation." He nodded. First thing tomorrow. They went inside. He helped her with the dishes. They sat on the porch in the cooling dark, closer together than they had been sitting before their conversation in the kitchen, her shoulder against his arm. And the sky above them was enormous and full of stars, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass and the faint, distant possibility of rain. "Oliver," she said. "Yes. I'm glad I came to Texas." He turned his head and looked at her profile in the dark, the clean line of her jaw, the way she was watching the sky. "I'm glad you came to Texas," he said. She turned and looked at him in that way she had, direct and unguarded, and he felt the full weight of it, the entirety of what this was, and he kissed her, which was not planned, which was simply what happened when you had reached the limit of what could be adequately expressed in language. She kissed him back without hesitation or surprise, as though she had been waiting for him to catch up to something she had already decided, which, he suspected, was probably accurate. They told Judge Irrington about Hewitt the next morning. The judge listened with the attentive seriousness of a man who had seen this particular pattern before: the drought year's opportunism, the pressure campaigns against struggling landowners, and he made a record of it, and told them that he would be in communication with the Land Records Office in San Angelo, and that Mr. Hewitt would find the county considerably less receptive to his concerns going forward. The Saturday wedding was small, which was the only kind of wedding that made sense in their circumstances, but it was attended by Mrs. Calloway, who dressed formally and cried without embarrassment, and by the Ruiz family from 3 miles east, who had built the house with Oliver and who brought food and treated the occasion with a warmth that made Irene press Oliver's hand very hard during the informal supper afterward. Oliver had not thought much about the ceremony itself beforehand, beyond the practical logistics of it. He had not anticipated what it would feel like to stand in front of Judge Irrington with Irene Dawson next to him and say the words that had been said in wedding ceremonies for centuries, the ones about being together in the good and in the difficult and in all the in-between. He had not anticipated the way she said them back, without any tremor, clear and direct, meaning every word, being exactly who she was in every one of them. He had not anticipated the fact that he would have to concentrate somewhat to keep his own voice steady. September arrived, and with it, finally, the first real rain in 14 months. It came on a Tuesday night without warning, the way rain in that part of Texas sometimes did, without any of the theatrical buildup of a storm, just a sudden change in the air and then the sound on the roof. And Oliver woke in the dark and lay still for a moment listening to it, and his chest was doing something that felt like the gray weight dissolving, very slowly, the way frost dissolves off a window glass. Irene was awake beside him. He could tell from the quality of her stillness. "Rain," he said. "Yes," she said. After a moment she got up and went to the window, and he went and stood behind her, and they watched the rain come down on the parched ground. the first real, soaking rain in more than a year, and Irene had one hand on the windowsill and he put his hand over hers, and she leaned back into him without saying anything, and they watched the rain together until it slowed and stopped, and the sky was clean, and the air smelled like the world beginning again. September brought the Dupree cattle, a small herd of 12, which was modest enough to be manageable and enough to begin with. Oliver drove them out to the east field where the grass was already responding to the rain with a speed that seemed almost desperate, and Irene rode alongside him for part of it. Her horse picked up in the same trade that had produced the goats, and she was a competent but not experienced rider, and she concentrated with the furrow-browed focus she brought to any skill she was in the process of acquiring. "You are improving considerably," he told her. She gave him a sideways look that suggested she was aware he was being encouraging rather than strictly accurate. "I am not falling off," she said. "That is my current standard." He laughed. Actually laughed, which surprised him slightly, because laughing had become unfamiliar. It was a short, genuine laugh, and she looked pleased by it, and he noticed that she looked pleased by it, and he filed that away. October came in with cooler air and a second rain, and Irene's replanted kitchen garden row coming in with enough production to feel like a genuine win against the summer's damage. The goats were providing milk, and the small herd was settling, and Oliver had made the first payment on the Dupree debt from a modest sale at the Marlow Creek stock auction. And while none of it was prosperity, it was clearly progress, clearly the arc beginning to turn. They found a rhythm that suited both of them. They worked through the morning side by side or on parallel tasks depending on what the day required, and ate a midday meal together at the kitchen table. And in the evenings they tended to the quieter work, the accounts, the mending, the correspondence, the reading, and they had long conversations that moved through more ground than Oliver would have previously thought a conversation could cover, from the practical immediacy of ranch decisions to the wider world, the presidential politics they had both followed. The scientific discoveries reported in the newspapers that arrived from San Angelo 2 weeks late, but still with the freshness of ideas that mattered, the books that Irene had brought in her trunk and was working through systematically and pressing on him with the evangelical certainty of a teacher who knew when someone else would care about a thing. He read the books she gave him. He told her honestly what he thought of them. Their disagreements were spirited and specific, and he found himself looking forward to them with an enthusiasm that he recognized as being several degrees past purely intellectual. He also found, increasingly, that she made him laugh. She had a particular kind of humor that operated at a slight remove from the obvious, dry and specific, and she deployed it without ceremony, worked it into sentences as though she were simply observing something neutral, and then left the observation to do its work. And the first few times he had not quite caught it fast enough and had found himself responding a beat late, which she found amusing, and which had prompted a very enjoyable conversation about the regional differences in what qualified as a joke. "In Ohio," she told him, "a joke usually announces itself. And in Virginia," he said, "a joke is usually someone else's expense and everyone pretends not to notice." "What about Texas?" he considered. "In Texas, a joke is something that happens to you and you choose afterward to find it funny." She thought about this for a moment. "That is either profound or very depressing." "Frequently both," he said, and the corner of her mouth went up in that particular way, and he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he was an exceptionally fortunate man. November brought the first real cold and the news, delivered by way of the Marlow Creek General Store proprietor, that Gerald Hewitt had indeed been the subject of formal complaints from 3 other county landowners, and that his acquisition concerns had been referred to the county attorney in San Angelo for review. Oliver told Irene this over supper, and she said, "Good," in a tone of complete satisfaction, and applied herself to her corn bread with the air of someone closing a door on an unpleasant subject. She was, he had discovered, excellent at closing doors on unpleasant subjects. Not in the way of someone who was avoiding the subject, but in the way of someone who had dealt with it thoroughly and saw no further utility in keeping it open. He found this quality in her to be one of the most specifically useful and also the most specifically attractive things about her, though he could not have explained the connection if pressed. She was also, he had discovered, someone who found his silences comfortable rather than troubling, which was perhaps the single most significant discovery he had made about what it was like to be with her. He had spent enough of his life with people who found his silences troubling, who needed to fill them, who interpreted quietness as disapproval or unhappiness or some kind of deficit. And Irene simply let silence be silence and was in it with him, and it felt, in those moments, more intimate than words. December brought a third rain, and the news from Virginia that his mother was ill. The letter was from his father, which was unusual in itself, and it was written in his father's characteristically sparse and controlled style, but the sparseness in this case communicated more than elaboration would have, and Oliver sat with the letter for a long time at the kitchen table before Irene came in from outside and saw his face. He told her. She sat down across from him and listened and did not immediately say anything reassuring because she knew from living with him that what he needed was to be heard rather than comforted. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "The ranch is manageable for a few weeks," she said. "The Ruiz family would help. I can handle most of what needs handling." She paused. "If you need to go, you should go." "The relationship with my father, I know," she said. "But your mother is sick and you have not seen her in 3 years, and some things can be repaired and some cannot, and you won't know which is which if you don't go." He looked at her across the table. "Would you come with me?" he said, a pause very small. "Yes," she said, "if you want me to." "I want you to," he said immediately. They made the arrangements. Mrs. Calloway agreed to keep an eye on things, and the Ruiz family agreed to cover the daily work. And they took the train from Marlow Creek in the second week of December, east to Virginia, which neither of them had seen in years, and both of them, for different reasons, approached with a mixture of feeling that was difficult to separate into its components. Virginia was cold and green and vertical in ways that Texas had completely erased from Oliver's muscle memory, and he stepped off the train in Richmond feeling slightly disoriented, as though he had stepped into a version of himself that was younger and less tested, and not entirely sure how he fit in this landscape anymore. His mother was in a substantial house in a good Richmond neighborhood, and she was ill with the consumption that was ravaging her lungs, though she was still upright and still herself. And when Oliver came through the door, she held him for a long time without saying anything, and he let her. And when she pulled back and looked at him, she said, "You look well," with such genuine relief in her voice that his throat tightened. She looked at Irene, who was standing slightly back with the courtesy of someone who understood this was a reunion that needed its own space. "You must be Irene," his mother said. "I am," Irene said, and came forward and took his mother's hand. His mother held it and looked at Irene with the measuring, clear-eyed attention of a woman who had not always been able to act on her own judgments but had spent a lifetime making them. And whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her because her face softened, and she said, "Oliver wrote us about you. He was considerably more enthusiastic than he probably intended to be." Oliver looked at Irene. Irene looked at Oliver with an expression that was the particular kind of enjoyment that is composed primarily of information she would be using later. His father was harder. His father was a tall, contained man of 62 who had not been warm when Oliver left and had not found a way to warm in the intervening years, and who received Oliver's presence with a formality that was not quite coldness but was not far from it. Oliver did not try to force the thing. He was civil and present, and he helped where help was practical, and he did not ask for anything that wasn't offered freely. On the third evening his father found him alone in the study and stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, "Your wife is a remarkable woman." Oliver said, "She is." His father said, She sat with your mother for 2 hours this afternoon, and your mother was laughing. I have not heard her laugh in months. A pause. Irene has that effect, Oliver said. His father was quiet for a moment, looking at the bookshelf. I was wrong about the West, he said finally in the tone of a man for whom those 4 words cost everything he had. I know, Oliver said, which was the kindest response available. He came back to Texas with his wife in the first week of January 1884, and the ranch looked both exactly as he had left it and somehow better, the way places do when you have been away long enough to see them fresh. Irene walked the kitchen garden first thing, checking the state of it in the winter cold, and she came back in with her cheeks red from the cold air and her eyes bright, and she said, "The garlic I planted in November is coming up." And he felt a warmth in his chest that was so large and specific it was almost uncomfortable. January and February were cold, but not cruelly so, and the work of winter was the work of planning and maintenance. And Oliver spent long evenings at the desk, working out the figures for the spring with a focus that was motivated by something different than survival anxiety now, that was motivated by something closer to ambition, the specific ambition of a man who has something real to build toward. Irene had begun corresponding with the Marlow Creek School Board in October, and in January she received word that the position of teacher in the Marlow Creek schoolhouse, which had been held by an elderly man who was retiring, was hers if she wanted it. She told Oliver over breakfast with a careful neutrality that he recognized as her waiting to see how he received the news before she reacted to it herself. He said, "That's wonderful. When do you start?" She looked at him. "It will be 3 days a week. I can still manage everything here." "I know you can," he said. "That wasn't I'm glad, Irene. That's work that matters to you." She looked at him for another moment with that expression he'd learned to read as meaning she was receiving something that had meaning beyond its surface. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way she always meant it, fully. She began teaching in February. She rode to Marlow Creek on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday mornings on her horse, and came back in the late afternoons with stories about her students that she told over supper in a way that was vivid and specific. And that revealed, in the telling, exactly how much she invested in each one of them, and how closely she paid attention to the particular kind of intelligence that each child carried. He listened to these stories with an attention that was partly about the stories themselves, and partly about watching her tell them, the way she came alive in the telling, the way her hands moved when she was describing something a particular student had done that had surprised her. One February evening she told him about a boy named Calhoun Ruiz, the youngest of the Ruiz family's children, who was 9 years old and who had been convinced he could not read because an earlier teacher had conveyed to him, in the careless way of people who deal in large numbers and forget to consider individual ones, that he was slow. Irene had spent 2 weeks finding the specific approach that worked for Calhoun, and that week he had read a full paragraph aloud, correctly, for the first time. She told Oliver this at supper, and her voice was careful and even, but her eyes were doing the thing she tried to contain, that particular light she had described in one of her earliest letters as what she most loved about teaching. Oliver listened, and when she finished he said, "You gave that boy back something that was taken from him." She looked at him. "That is exactly what it was," she said quietly. He refilled her coffee cup, and she looked at him in that way she had, the full, direct attention that he still, after months, felt in his chest like a hand pressed flat against it. March came in like something meant, with rains that were consistent and soaking and transformative. The grass on the east field came up green and real, and Oliver stood at the fence line and looked at it, and felt the thing in his chest that he had been carrying so long he had stopped registering it begin, genuinely, to lift. The gray place. He had called it that in his mind for so long, and now, standing at the fence line in the March rain looking at the green grass, he could feel the last residual weight of it releasing, like the way the ground releases water once it has absorbed all it can. He went inside and found Irene at the kitchen table grading exercises her students had turned in, her hair loose from its pin on the left side, which was its permanent tendency, and flour on her jaw, which meant she had been baking earlier, and she looked up at him with the simple, immediate attention she always gave him, the attention that said he was always welcome in her awareness without ceremony or apology. He sat down across from her. "The east field is green," he said. She smiled slowly, fully. "I saw from the window. I think we're through it," he said. "The drought, I think we're through it." She looked at him across the table, in the afternoon light, in the sound of the rain on the roof. "I think we are," she said. They sat together for a while with the exercise papers between them and the rain coming down and the green field outside and the warmth of the kitchen and the warmth of what they were together, the specific warmth of two people who have built something real through difficult country, and know, in their bones, that it will hold. The cattle grew from 12 to 22 by the spring of 1884. Oliver negotiated a fair market deal at the summer auction that cleared the Dupree debt entirely, which was a day he marked privately with a glass of whiskey on the porch, because some things warranted marking. Irene's garden produced abundantly that summer, and she put up enough preserves to see them comfortably through a hard winter if one came. And she did it with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned the previous summer's lesson and was not interested in repeating it. The Marlow Creek School Board was so pleased with her work that they expanded her position to 5 days a week in the fall of 1884, and she accepted with the clear-eyed pleasure of someone who knows when something is going well and is willing to say so. It was in October of 1884, on a cool, clear evening with the first real autumn color in the scrub oak along the south fence, that Irene told Oliver she was expecting a child. She told him at supper directly, without ceremony, in the way she did everything important. He sat very still for a moment. Then he got up from the table and came around to her side of it and crouched next to her chair and took her hands in his, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and he could see that underneath the steadiness she was waiting, with the same contained vulnerability she had shown him once before in the barn, waiting to know how he received it. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. "This is—" He stopped. He tried again. "This is the best news I have ever received." She let out a breath that she had been holding without knowing it, and he saw the vulnerability release into something warmer and brighter, and she put one hand against his face, and he turned into it like something finding the sun. "I'm glad," she said, very quietly. "I'm very glad, Oliver." He kissed her hand, and then he stood and pulled her up and held her in the kitchen in the October evening with the scrub oak turning color outside and the cattle in the east field and the green, recovered grass and the whole changed world of a place that had been through a drought and come out the other side as something better than it was before. The winter was mild. The spring came early. On a Saturday morning in May of 1885, their son was born, delivered with the assistance of the nearest midwife, a steady-handed woman named Clara who came out from Marlow Creek the night before, and stayed through the labor with the calm competence of someone who had done this work many times and still took it seriously every time. Oliver spent most of the labor in the yard, which Clara had directed him to without any ambiguity whatsoever, because she had done this long enough to know that a frightened husband in the room was a hindrance and not a help. He split more firewood than they would need for 3 winters. He walked the fence line 3 times. He sat on the porch steps in the early morning light with his hands clasped, and his heart doing things that he had not prepared for, and that no amount of preparation would have helped with. When Clara opened the door and told him to come in, her voice had that quality of a thing completed successfully, and he went in and there was Irene, exhausted and completely herself, with a red and squalling and enormously present small person in the crook of her arm, and she looked up at him with the most open, unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face, all the careful composure gone, just her, fully there. "Come meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the small face, the clenched fists, the indignant vitality of a new person insisting on his own existence. "He looks ready to argue with someone," he said. "He's mine," Irene said. "Of course he does." Oliver laughed, which surprised him, which was perhaps the wrong reaction and also precisely the right one, the kind of laugh that comes from the place where joy is too large for any more controlled response. They named him James, for Irene's father, whose full name had been James Dawson, the veterinarian from Granville who had taught his daughter to approach problems systematically and without panic, and who would have liked, Oliver thought, the life his daughter had built in Texas. James Wallace grew from a newborn to a sitting, then crawling, then determinedly upright small person with the same focused speed that his mother brought to all acquisitions of skill. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's tendency toward particular, concentrated silences, and he had Irene's brown eyes in a face that combined both of them in proportions that Oliver found himself studying sometimes with a feeling that was approximately the feeling of standing at the fence line in the first March rain, which was to say, the feeling of something immense and undeserved and entirely real. The ranch continued to grow. By the fall of 1886, the herd had reached 45 head, and Oliver had hired a hand. A young man of 20 named Thomas, who was quiet and reliable, and who learned fast, and who in his first week had, completely unsolicited, repaired the loose board on the barn door that Oliver had been meaning to get to for 2 months. Irene made Thomas supper the first Friday of every week as a standing arrangement, and Thomas received these suppers with the careful gratitude of someone who understood the gesture was a substantial one. Irene continued teaching. She became, in the estimation of most people in Marlow Creek, the best teacher the school had had in its existence, which was a judgment applied with the specificity of a community that had been paying attention. She had a way with children that was not soft exactly, but was profoundly patient and profoundly attentive to the particular quality of each child's mind, and the children who came through her classroom tended to remember it for reasons they could sometimes articulate and sometimes simply felt as a direction they had been pointed in. The school board offered her the role of head teacher in 1887. She discussed it with Oliver at supper on the evening she received the letter, and he said, with genuine pleasure and no hesitation, "You should accept," and she did. Mrs. Calloway came to supper every Sunday. She had been doing this since the summer of 1883, and neither she nor they had ever made a formal arrangement of it. It was simply what happened. She argued cheerfully and specifically with Irene about cooking, planting, and the proper raising of children, and was wrong about 1/3 of these arguments and right about the other 2/3, and she accepted both outcomes with equal good humor. She adored James with the particular intensity of a woman who had lost her own children too young, and James adored her back with the uncomplicated totality of a small person who recognizes unconditional attention when he receives it. In the spring of 1887, Oliver received a letter from his father. It was longer than his father's letters usually were, and it was, in his father's characteristically compressed way, an apology. It said that his mother's health had declined further over the winter, and that his father had had occasion, in the long quiet of illness attending, to think about some things, and that what he had come to was the conclusion that he had been wrong in how he had received Oliver's departure, that he had been wrong in treating ambition as disloyalty and independence as defection, and that he was, the letter said, "I am proud of what you have built there." Oliver read it twice at the kitchen table, and then gave it to Irene without comment. She read it and handed it back, and she put her hand over his on the table and said nothing, because there was nothing to add, only the solid presence of her beside him, which was what he needed and which she was always able to provide. He wrote back to his father. It was a careful letter, not rushing the reconciliation, not pretending that the years of distance were simply erased, but extending the thing that his father had extended, the willingness to try. His mother died in August of 1887. She died on a Wednesday, and his father wrote him on Thursday, and the letter reached Marlow Creek 10 days later, And Oliver sat on the porch in the dusk and was very quiet for a long time, and Irene came out and sat next to him. And she took his hand and he held it. And the Texas sky did its extravagant sunset colors, purple and orange and the deep red that he had tried to describe to her once, and that she had come to love as much as he did. And they sat together until the dark came and the stars came out, enormous and close, the way they always were in this sky. She knew you were well, Irene said. She saw it in Virginia. Yes, he said. She was glad of it. I know, he said. They sat a while longer. Come inside, she said, eventually. James is asking for you. He let her pull him up, and they went inside together to their son and their kitchen, and the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built from letters and drought and determination, and the specific, sustaining fact of each other. James acquired a little sister in the autumn of 1888, a small, determined person who arrived in October, and who was given the name Clara, for the midwife who had been present at James's birth, and who had retired the previous spring, and who received the news of the naming with a delighted formality that suggested it was the honor she had always considered correctly deserved. Clara was, from the earliest age, entirely her own person. She had her father's coloring, the dark blonde hair and the blue eyes that surprised everyone who expected the dark eyes of her mother and her brother. And she had a quality of absolute certainty about her own judgments that made Irene look at Oliver sometimes with an expression that said she found this both recognizable and faintly alarming. She is going to be extraordinary, Irene told him one evening, watching 3-year-old Clara instruct her 5-year-old brother on the correct way to feed the goats, with a precision and authority that suggested she had been thinking about this for some time. She is going to be formidable, Oliver said. Those are the same thing, Irene said. He looked at her with the look he had, the one that he had developed for her specifically and that she had catalogued, and that said without any ambiguity everything he felt. She raised an eyebrow at him. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I was just thinking. About what? About how right you were, he said. About Texas. She looked at him. I didn't say anything about Texas. That was you. I know. I was agreeing with things you didn't say out loud. She shook her head, the particular small smile on her face that he had come to consider his most reliable measure of happiness. Oliver, she said. Yes, I'm glad we did this, she said. It was the simplest thing and also the most complete thing, and he felt it go through him from the center, warm and certain and lasting. So am I, he said, every day. And then it was the evening in late November of 1889, and they were all at the supper table, Oliver and Irene and James, who was 4.5 now, and in the stage of development characterized primarily by questions, and Clara, who was 1 year old and eating corn bread with a focus that suggested she considered this a professional undertaking, and Mrs. Calloway at the end of the table where she always sat on Sundays, and Thomas the ranch hand who had become, over 3 years, more family than employee and who sat at the table with the ease of someone who has been claimed by a household and accepted the claiming. It had been a good day. It had been a good year. The herd was at 62 head, and the drought felt like a thing that had happened in another life, though Oliver knew the land well enough to know that drought was always possible, and that the memory of it was part of how you took care. The rain had been regular, and the grass had been good, and the kitchen garden had been abundant, and the school had been full, and Irene had come home from it every day with that particular brightness, the teacher's brightness, the brightness of someone whose work makes regular contact with meaning. They were eating. James was, in his 4-year-old way, narrating the day's significant events, which included a disagreement with the red rooster that lived in the yard, and which James had clearly been composing into a formal account since it happened. Clara was defeating the corn bread. Mrs. Calloway was arguing pleasantly with Thomas about the correct angle for fence post setting. Oliver was listening to all of it with the unhurried pleasure of a man who has learned, through a long and specific education, to receive the ordinary goodness of a thing while it is happening. Irene was quiet in the way she sometimes was at table, not absent but observing, taking in the room with that open attention she gave to things she valued. Then she looked at James and his rooster story, which had reached its climax involving a fence post and a somewhat unflattering comparison between the rooster's intelligence and that of a stone, and she said something. She said it the way she said everything that was actually funny, which was in a completely even tone with no announcement whatsoever, and the specific thing she said, it was about the rooster, and it was about the fence post, and it connected two things in a way that was so precisely and unexpectedly right that for a moment the table was simply quiet. And then Oliver Wallace laughed. He did not laugh the polite, contained laugh of a man in company. He laughed the way something long buried finally claws its way free of the earth. He laughed with his whole body, bent at the middle, hand on the table for balance, and it was not careful or measured, and it was not the laugh of a man who had been carefully maintaining himself. It was the laugh of a man who was simply, completely, freely himself in a room full of people he loved. He could not stop. He could feel everyone at the table watching him. He could feel Irene watching him, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, those dark eyes bright with something between delight and amazement, and the flour streak on her jaw from the afternoon's baking, and her hair loose on the left side. And she was the full, specific, irreducible fact of herself, and he could not stop laughing, and he did not want to stop. He pressed his fist to his mouth. He turned his face to the window where the November dark was pressing against the glass, and the yellow lamplight of their kitchen was holding it at bay, warm and absolute. He thought about the gray place. He thought about the spring of 1882, when the last real laugh had left him, and the drought had settled in like a permanent weather. He thought about the letter he had written to the correspondence service on a blank evening in January, and all the particular chain of things that had followed from it. The woman on the train platform with the direct gaze and the single trunk. The kitchen reorganized and the pump fixed, and the conversation in the barn and the words in the kitchen and the rain in September, and the green field in March and the boy named James, and the girl named Clara and the Sunday suppers and the Virginia reconciliation and this house. This specific, built house on this specific, recovered land, with this specific woman who had said something at supper and made him laugh the way he had not laughed since. Before the drought, he caught his breath finally. He looked at Irene. She was watching him with that expression, the one he never tried to describe because no description was adequate, the open, full, entirely unguarded look of someone who is simply there with you. "Oliver," she said quietly. "I know," he said, which was not a response to any particular question but was the only complete answer to all of them. James looked between them with the satisfied expression of someone who has concluded that the adults have arrived at something important but is not certain what. Clara picked up another piece of corn bread. "Mrs." Calloway cleared her throat and reached for her coffee cup with the air of someone who had understood the moment, and was graciously ceding the space of it while maintaining the dignified fiction of attending to her beverage. Thomas looked at the tablecloth with the modest discretion of a young man who had grown up well. Oliver Wallace sat at the supper table in the house he had built on the land he had refused to surrender through 3 years of drought and pressure and loneliness, and he looked at his wife who had come from Ohio with a trunk and a direct gaze and a letter that said she would not stay quiet to keep the peace, and he felt in his chest, with the full clarity of a man who has spent a long time in a gray place and knows what the difference is, the specific, enormous, particular gravity of being exactly where you are supposed to be. "More corn bread," Irene said. "Please," he said. She passed it to him, and her fingers brushed his when he took it, and they looked at each other across the supper table in their kitchen in the Texas evening with their children and their people around them. And the light was warm and the rain had come back and the land was green and the gray place was gone, and everything that had been built through the difficult country of their particular lives held in this moment like something meant to last. It did last. The years that followed were the years of building and growing, and the regular passage of time that good lives are made of. James went to his mother's school and proved to be exactly the student she had suspected, the kind whose mind moved laterally and made unexpected connections. And she taught him with the same attentiveness she gave every child, and perhaps with one additional layer of the fierce, specific pride that a parent who is also a teacher must carefully manage in a classroom, which she managed without anyone who was watching too closely being able to say she had failed. Clara, at the age of 3, informed the red rooster who had survived his earlier encounter with James that he was in her domain now, and she expected a certain behavioral standard. And the rooster, in what Oliver considered one of the more remarkable capitulations he had witnessed, appeared to substantially comply. His father came to Texas in the spring of 1891. He came alone, and he came on the train, and Oliver met him at the Marlow Creek platform, and they stood for a moment in the West Texas sun, two men with the complicated history of fathers and sons between them. And then his father held out his hand, and Oliver shook it, and then, unexpectedly, his father's hand tightened on his, and they stood like that for a moment, which was as much as either of them had language for. Oliver brought him home. Irene received him with the direct, unceremonious warmth that she brought to everything, made him coffee, showed him the ranch, introduced him to James and Clara with the matter-of-fact affection of someone who simply loves her children and does not perform the love for an audience. Oliver's father spent 2 weeks on the ranch, and he spent a portion of most days simply watching the work, the cattle and the fencing and the daily management of the recovered land. And on the last evening before his train back, he sat with Oliver on the porch in the cooling April dark and said, without preamble, "You were right about this place." Oliver said, "I know." His father almost smiled. "You could afford to be less satisfied about that." "I've earned it," Oliver said. His father looked at the dark field and the star-thick sky and said nothing for a while, and then said, "Your mother would have loved it here." "I know that too," Oliver said. The years continued. The ranch grew to 112 head by 1893. Thomas married a young woman from Marlow Creek named Edith, who had been one of Irene's students some years prior, which everyone treated with the comfortable affection of a connection. They had all been waiting to become official. The Ruiz family expanded and prospered and remained the nearest and most constant neighbors, and the friendship between the families was the kind that does not require tending, because it is simply part of the ground. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1895, Oliver Wallace woke early and lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet of the house he had built, listening to the complete silence that is only available at that particular hour, and beside him Irene was still asleep, her dark hair against the pillow, her breathing the slow and even breathing of someone at rest in a place that is entirely safe. He lay still and listened to the house, the small sounds of it. James upstairs, probably already awake and reading, because James was always already awake and reading. Clara, who had inherited her mother's capacity for sleep as a serious endeavor, still fully committed to it. The horse in the barn, the cattle in the field, the first bird beginning outside, the tentative early note that precedes the full morning chorus by 20 minutes. The land was green. The sky outside the window, visible through the faint beginning light, was the particular clear blue of Texas October, the good version, the version that had rain behind it and cool air in it, and all the colors it was about to turn. He thought about a man sitting on a porch in 1882 looking at dead grass, and feeling the gray weight of a world that was not rewarding effort and patience and honest work. He thought about a blank piece of paper and a letter to a correspondence service. He thought about a train platform in March and a woman with a direct gaze and a single trunk. He thought about what she had said at supper, the specific thing, the perfect thing, the thing that had pulled him out of the gray place so completely that even the memory of laughter was a warmth in his chest. He thought about how love comes, sometimes, not in one dramatic moment but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. The pump fixed together, the garden in the drought, the barn at night, the kitchen table with the lamplight and the honest words, the rain on the roof in September, the green field in March, the children who are entirely themselves, the Sundays and the suppers and the years. He turned his head and looked at his wife in the gray morning light. She opened her eyes. She looked at him with the morning version of that look, undressed of everything except itself. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. Outside, the first bird was still singing. The sky was getting lighter, the blue deepening into the specific Texas blue that he had tried to describe to her once, and that she had come to know herself from her own experience of this land, this sky, this life. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I was thinking about the letter I wrote to the correspondence service," he said. She was quiet, watching him. "I was thinking that it was the best letter I ever wrote," he said, "and that I had no idea what I was doing when I wrote it." "Neither did I when I wrote back," she said, "but I thought you sounded like someone worth the risk." "And," he said. She looked at him with the full, unhurried attention she had given him from the first moment, and which had not diminished by a single degree in all the years, and all the ordinary moments, and all the difficult ones between. "And I was right," she said simply. He took her hand under the covers and she laced her fingers through his, and outside the morning was coming fully in, gold and clear and generous, and the land was green, and the cattle were in the field, and the children were in their rooms, and the house was standing on its foundation exactly as he had built it, solid and real and made to last. He had not laughed since before the drought. She had said something at supper, and he could not stop. And in the long, good, accumulated years between that moment and this one, he had laughed more times than he could count, and each time it had the same quality, the quality of something free, something that belonged entirely to this life he had built with this woman in this place, the full, genuine, completely unlocked sound of a man who has found, against the evidence of difficult seasons, that the world does in fact reward patience and effort and honest work. And that the best thing it rewards you with is not prosperity, though prosperity is welcome, and not the end of hardship, though that too is welcome, but the specific and irreplaceable fact of a person beside you who knows you completely and stays anyway and says things at supper that make you laugh, and looks at you in the morning like you are the answer to a question she was glad to have asked. The morning light came all the way in. Oliver Wallace looked at his wife. Irene Wallace looked back at him, and the day began.